Hello everyone and welcome to Tech Unveiled. Have you ever wondered about the difference between distributed and centralized radio access networks? Well, if so, then you're in the right spot. Because in this episode, we will explain when and where you should consider centralized RAN deployments and what impact 5G has on that decision. My name is Lena and I will be your host, but now let's unveil this topic together with our experts. So with me here today, I have two network evolution experts, Anders Söderlund for RAN and Robert Laczko for transport. Welcome to Tech Unveiled.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe you can start with describing what a centralized radio access network is.
Absolutely. Let's start with the most common deployment option today, which is decentralized RAN. In this case, you have all RAN processing on the antenna site, and the transport solution in this case is referred to as backhaul leading up to the core network. Centralized RAN, or C-RAN in short, on the other hand, there you move a large part of the processing into a central office or data center. And from this data center, then you can control multiple antenna sites. And the transport solution in this case is referred to as fronthaul from the antenna sites into the central office. Generally speaking, the fronthaul has higher bandwidth requirements and shorter latency requirements compared to backhaul. And this is important to keep in mind when evaluating if C-RAN makes sense or not.
So Robert, with 5G now being rolled out, does that change anything for centralized versus distributed RAN?
Yes, there is a difference. With 5G, service providers start to introduce services using mid-band and high-band spectrum assets. And these new bands enable a massive capacity to the end users, but at the same time, they introduce new requirements on the transport network. And these lead to an investment decision. The question service providers need to ask themselves, shall we expand our backhaul in the current architecture or introduce a centralized architecture and invest into a fronthaul type of transport network?
So what are then the potential benefits of a centralized RAN? I mean, why should service providers consider it versus distributed RAN?
Okay, I'd like to mention three potential gains. The first one being that there is less equipment on the antenna site. This can be beneficial when doing capacity expansions or doing new site acquisition. The second part is about, when you do centralized processing, it's easier to do coordination between the antenna sites and do things like carrier aggregation and uplink comp. And thirdly, I would say operationally, you can increase the hardware utilization, and having all the processing resources in one place makes it easier to expand capacity and handle things like spectrum migration. So, but the service provider needs to look at the existing network and see if it is fit to migrate successfully over to C-RAN.
So now we know the potential benefits of centralized RAN, but when should a service provider consider it?
Okay, let's illustrate this with two examples. So I will have the first example where we consider a suburban setting where you have a homogeneous network with only macro sites and no small cells, also with moderate traffic growth in this area. And in this case, the service provider has a microwave backhaul that can be capacity upgraded to support the new 5G bands. Okay, so let's look at the gains and costs of the equation. And let's start then with the site simplification. And in this case, it's relatively small gain, because normally on a macro site you have a cabinet already where you have batteries and rectifiers, and often in there you can put the RAN processing equipment. So site simplification is quite small. Also, if you look at the coordination gains, Since this is a homogeneous network, it means that coordination gains are a bit smaller, less need to do, for example, carrier aggregation between the sites. And thirdly, operationally then, since the traffic growth is moderate in this area, you can normally handle the capacity expansions by adding a band to existing sites. So I put one Lego block for that as well. Now let's look at the cost side of the equation.
Yeah.
If the service provider is to build new fiber, dig new fiber to the sites, that's very expensive. So I put 4 Lego blocks for that. And also the service provider will need to have a data center or a central office to place the RAN processing equipment. I put two Lego blocks there. And as you can see, the gains are smaller than the costs. And in this case, better to stay with decentralized RAN.
Absolutely.
And maybe, Robert, you can take the second example.
Yes, of course. Let's imagine a dense urban area with the potential for very high traffic growth. Also, this network that is deployed here is a heterogeneous one, consisting of both small cell and macro layers. And lastly, let's assume that the operator has access to fiber and some sort of hub or data center facility. Let's start with the gains, and I'll start with the site simplification also. Heterogeneous networks with small cell deployments, they offer a greater potential for reduction of equipment on the sites. So I put down 2 Lego blocks for the gains. Additionally to this, the heterogeneous network has the opportunity to introduce those coordination services Anders mentioned earlier. So the results are higher performance gains in the radio network. And lastly, since this is an area with heavy traffic growth requiring more frequent updates or expansions or densification, a centralized architecture could introduce some benefits from an operational perspective as well. If we look at the cost side of the house, the operator has already access to fiber, so the fronthaul investment costs are lower since they can reuse some existing investments for this area. And the same applies to the hub or data center location. What we may have to do is some capacity expansion on an existing location. So if we summarize our exercise, we can see that in this specific scenario, it actually makes sense to introduce a centralized architecture. But then these 2 examples are just extreme cases to demonstrate the logic, the considerations that service providers need to go through when selecting the best network architecture. In real life, there can be multiple different scenarios in between these, but the logic will be the same. Yeah.
But I think this is clear. I mean, looking at it like this, it's clear that in a dense urban area with a lot of small cells, then it does make sense. While in a suburban area with a homogeneous network, less so, right?
Yeah, correct.
But then let's assume that the service provider then decides to go with centralized RAN. What are then the key things to think about when deploying it?
And one of these aspects could be the fronthaul network architecture. With having fiber in place, the operators have the opportunity to either use an optical WDM solution or a packetized architecture for the fronthaul transport. In certain cases, even microwave systems could be used as an option in the toolbox. Which option we choose from this toolbox, it always depends on the existing infrastructure in place, and it needs to be decided case by case. But whichever option we take, it's very important to keep in mind that very strict transport network requirement has to be met, for example, around latency and synchronization. Otherwise, radio performance could be impacted.
Another thing to consider is the processing option to use in the data center, to use purpose-built hardware or cloud infrastructure for the processing. And there are advantages with both options.
And we actually covered that in a previous Tech Unveiled episode, evaluating processing in RAN, right?
Yes, correct.
Good, but then Anders, to summarize, how would you say that Ericsson can support service providers in this decision of centralized versus decentralized RAN?
So basically, I think we've seen here that centralized RAN then will be a complement to decentralized RAN. So you will need both, and Ericsson has the experience to build both, and we have the equipment. Also, if you look at centralized RAN, we have both options, purpose-built hardware and cloud RAN in the portfolio. And also when building the fronthaul, we have a full portfolio with WDM solutions and packetized fronthaul solutions. So I think a broad portfolio is what you get from Ericsson to handle the complete network.
Great. Thank you, Anders, and thank you, Robert, for sharing your expertise with us here today. And thank you all for joining. It has been a pleasure to host this discussion on centralized RAN. And should you want to learn more about the topic, I can warmly recommend our blog. You find it on ericsson.com/techunveiled, or just reach out to us for further discussions. But now, take care, stay safe, and I hope to see you back soon to Tech Unveiled. Goodbye.